The wagon hit a rut so hard that Evelyn's hat box slid off the seat and landed in the dust of the trail, and she watched it bounce twice before coming to rest against a clump of dry sage. The driver, a weathered man named Cobb, who hadn't spoken more than 12 words in 4 hours, made no move to stop. "My hat," she said. "I see it." He did not slow down. Evelyn pressed her lips together, reached back over the seat, and grabbed the edge of her trunk to steady herself as the wagon lurched forward. The hatbox disappeared behind them in a rising cloud of red dust. She faced forward again, adjusted her collar, and told herself it didn't matter. It was just a hat. She had bigger things to worry about than a hat. The valley opened up ahead of her like something out of a painting, wide and flat and brutal in the afternoon sun, ringed on 3 sides by mountains that looked close enough to touch, but were probably 2 days' ride away. The grass here was sparse and yellow. The few trees she could see were cottonwoods clustered along what must have been a creek bed, and even they looked like they were working hard to stay alive. "That's it," Cobb said, nodding toward a collection of buildings that had materialized on the right side of the trail. "Blackstone." Evelyn looked. It wasn't what she'd pictured. She wasn't sure what she had pictured exactly. She'd read Wade Mercer's letters so many times that she'd started building a place in her mind without meaning to, filling in the gaps with details that said more about her imagination than his words. He'd written that the ranch was established and working, that there was a main house and a bunkhouse and proper outbuildings, that it sat on good land near water. All of that was technically true, she could see. The problem was what he hadn't written. The fences needed mending. 3 of the 4 visible fence posts on the near side were leaning at angles that suggested they'd been leaning for some time. The barn roof had a visible sag on the left side. The main house was large, she'd give it that, but its whitewash had faded to a dingy gray, and one of the porch steps was missing entirely. Chickens wandered loose in the yard, which meant either the coop door was broken or nobody had bothered to shut it. Cobb pulled the wagon up to the front of the house and stopped. He didn't say anything. He just sat there with his hands on the reins and waited. Evelyn climbed down herself. She had to drop the last foot because the step on the wagon was higher than she'd realized, and she landed harder than she intended, which sent a jolt up through both knees. She straightened her skirt, reached up for her trunk, and Cobb finally moved. He passed it down to her with the mild indifference of a man who had delivered many things to many places and expected none of them to be grateful. "Much obliged," she said. He turned the wagon and left without looking back. She stood there in the yard with her trunk at her feet and 6 boys watching her from various positions around the property. She counted them automatically, the way she'd been doing since she got Mercer's first letter, where he'd mentioned the boys almost as an afterthought. "I have 6 sons, ages 4 to 17, who will need a woman's guidance." The youngest, that would be the 4-year-old Thomas, was sitting on the porch with his knees pulled up to his chest. He was watching her with enormous dark eyes and absolutely no expression. The oldest was leaning against the barn with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low, and even from this distance she could see that he was doing everything in his power to look like he didn't care that she was here. None of them moved toward her. None of them spoke. She reached into the pocket of her traveling coat and touched the key. She'd received it 3 weeks ago, tucked inside Mercer's last letter before she departed, wrapped in a square of brown paper with a note that said, "Only," for the room at the end of the upstairs hall. "It was my wife's sewing room. Nobody uses it now. You can have it for your own things." The iron was cold even through the leather of her glove. She picked up her trunk handle with her other hand and walked toward the porch. The boy on the porch, Thomas, scrambled up and backed against the door like she might bite him. She stopped at the base of the steps, looked up at him, and smiled. Not the big performative smile she'd been practicing in the mirror back in Cincinnati, the one that was supposed to say, "I am a pleasant and capable woman who will be wonderful for your family." Just a regular smile. A tired one. "You must be Thomas," she said. He said nothing. His lower lip was doing something complicated. "I'm Evelyn. We wrote letters." He hadn't written any letters, obviously. He was 4. But she'd written a letter to each of the boys when she began corresponding with their father, and she'd received letters back from the 3 oldest. Stiff, formal things that had clearly been coached, but letters nonetheless. Thomas hadn't written back because Thomas couldn't write yet, but she'd included something for him anyway, a drawing of a horse she'd done herself, which was not a particularly good drawing. "Did you get the horse I drew?" she asked. His eyes shifted almost imperceptibly. So he had. She filed that away. Is your father inside? The door behind Thomas opened before he could answer, and Wade Mercer stepped out. She recognized him from the photograph he'd sent, which was a formal thing taken at some studio in town. He was standing rigidly in a suit that didn't quite fit, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had been told not to blink. In person, he was taller than she'd expected, with the kind of weathered quality that came from spending most of your life outside. His hair was dark, going gray at the temples, and he was not wearing a suit. He was wearing work clothes, a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, canvas trousers, boots with dried mud on them. His hands, she noticed, were the hands of a man who worked with them constantly. He stopped when he saw her. For a moment he just looked at her the way Thomas had, not unkind exactly, but assessing, figuring out what he'd gotten. She let him look. She was doing the same thing. Miss Hart, he said finally. His voice was lower than she'd expected. You made it. I did. She paused. It's Mrs. Mercer, I believe. As of 3 weeks ago, a flicker of something crossed his face. That's right. Yes. He came down off the porch, stepped past Thomas without looking at him, and reached for her trunk. I'll take that. Thank you. He hoisted it easily and carried it up the steps. Thomas had flattened himself against the doorframe to let his father pass, and now he was watching Evelyn with those enormous eyes again, trying to figure out what she was. The boys will introduce themselves at supper, Mercer said, holding the door open for her. Come inside, it's cooler. It was not, in fact, cooler. The front room was dim and stale-smelling, with the particular heat of a space that had been closed up during the day and hadn't had a window opened in it for some time. She stepped in and waited for her eyes to adjust. The room was large. That was the first thing. The ceiling was high and the floor was wide plank wood that had been good once and still retained the ghost of its former quality. There was a fireplace on the left wall, cold now, with ash that hadn't been cleaned out. A table near the windows. A settee with a worn-through arm. Books piled on a shelf in a way that suggested they'd been put there in a hurry and never properly organized. There were boots everywhere, at least 7 pairs that she could see, scattered around the room in various states of disrepair. A coat hung off the back of a chair. On the table sat the remnants of what had apparently been breakfast, never cleared. Mercer was watching her take it all in. She could feel it. I know it's not, he started. It's fine, she said. It's a lot of people in one house. Things get left. She did not say this is what happens when there's nobody managing the household. She did not say how long has it been like this. She picked the nearest pair of boots up from the floor and set them by the door, because her hands needed something to do, and because it was the most natural thing she could think of. And then she looked at him. Could I see the upstairs? She asked. And the kitchen? The kitchen was worse than the front room. Not filthy exactly. There was a difference between dirty and neglected, and this was the latter. The dishes had been washed, just stacked wrong. The flour sack on the counter had a small tear in the side that had been patched with what appeared to be a strip of cloth from a shirt. The wood box next to the stove was empty. The stove itself had been used recently, but the ash pan underneath needed emptying. There was a pot on the back of the stove with something dried in the bottom that she couldn't identify, and she did not try. She stood in the middle of it and catalogued. That was a habit she'd had since she was a girl, driving her mother half to distraction, walking into a room and immediately seeing what was wrong, what was missing, what needed doing. Her mother had called it a blessing and a curse in equal measure. Who's been cooking? She asked. Mercer was standing in the doorway. He had his arms crossed, not in the way of the oldest boy outside, aggressive, keep away, but in the way of a man who was tired and didn't know where to put his hands. Eli mostly. He's 14. He figured it out. Eli's been cooking for 7 people? 6. I eat simple. That wasn't the point, and something in her face must have said so because he shifted his weight. Before that it was me, mostly. We got by. She turned away from him and looked at the pantry shelf. There was flour, lard, some dried beans, half a smoked ham hock, 3 jars of something put up last fall. She unscrewed the lid of one and smelled it. Tomatoes. There were potatoes in a crate on the floor, most of them still good. A string of dried onions hanging from a nail near the window. Supper, she said mostly to herself. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She set the jar down and faced him. "Mr. Mercer." He blinked. "Wade. Wade." She tried it out. It felt strange in her mouth, the name of a man she'd married by proxy in a lawyer's office, while he was somewhere in a valley she'd never seen. "I want to be clear about something before I meet your sons at supper." He waited. "I didn't come here to be a servant. I know that might be what this looks like from the outside. A woman answering an advertisement, coming out to cook and clean and raise somebody else's children. I understand why people think that, but that's not what I intend, and I need you to know that from the start." He said nothing. His expression was careful, the expression of a man who had learned to keep his face from giving things away. "I'm going to cook supper tonight," she continued, "because those boys need a proper meal, and because I'm capable of providing one, and because it's the most useful thing I can do in the next 3 hours. But I need to know that we're in agreement about what this is." "What is it?" he asked. His voice was neutral, not cold exactly, just controlled. "A partnership," she said, "or the beginning of one. That's what I'm offering." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she started to wonder if she'd overstepped, if she'd come in too hard too fast, if she should have waited a week or a month or a season before saying any of that out loud. She was 26 years old and she had crossed half a continent to marry a stranger, and maybe she didn't have the right to make demands 3 hours after stepping off a wagon. Then he nodded, just once, short. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. He left her alone in the kitchen. She met the boys at supper. Their names were, in order of age, Caleb, 17, the one who'd been leaning against the barn with his hat pulled down; Noah, 15, Eli, 14, who turned out to be the one doing all the cooking, and who looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not hostile, more like a man who'd been laid off from a job he'd never wanted; Marcus, 12, Sam, 9, and Thomas, 4, who arrived at the table having apparently decided she was acceptable enough to sit near, because he positioned himself one chair down from where she stood and kept his eyes on her throughout the meal. She'd made a stew from the ham hock and beans and potatoes, with the dried onions and some herbs she'd found in a tin near the window. Someone had put them up at some point. She wasn't sure when. It wasn't a remarkable meal, but it had broth and substance, and she'd made a rough bread to go with it, which required borrowing a pan from a shelf too high for her to reach without standing on a crate, and it had come out a little uneven on one side, but edible. She set it on the table and stood back. The boys filed in and sat down. None of them looked at the food with any great enthusiasm, because they were adolescent males performing indifference, but she noticed Marcus sniff the air when he thought nobody was watching. Wade said nothing to introduce her. She hadn't asked him to. "The bread's lopsided," Caleb said. He was sitting at the far end of the table, still with his hat on, which she found irritating but chose not to address. "Not tonight. The pan's warped," she said. "Left side runs hot." He looked at her. She met his eyes and held them. He was 17 and he had her father's coloring and his grandmother's stubbornness in his jaw, and she'd known boys like him her whole life. He was scared of her. He just wasn't going to say so. "Still lopsided," he said. "You're welcome to make tomorrow's." Something happened at the table. She couldn't have said what exactly. It wasn't laughter. None of them actually laughed. But something shifted. Marcus looked down at his bowl. Noah covered his mouth with the back of his hand. Even Eli, with his unreadable expression, glanced sideways at Caleb. Caleb said nothing else. They ate. It was not a warm meal, meaning there was no warmth at the table, no conversation beyond the passing of bread and the occasional request for the salt. But they ate, all of them, and they ate well, and by the time the pot was cleared there was nothing left in it, which told her everything she needed to know. Afterward, Eli stood and began gathering bowls without being asked. Evelyn moved to help him. "I can do it," he said. "I know." She picked up the nearest bowl anyway. "2 people are faster than 1. He looked at her sideways. He had a serious face, this boy. Too serious for 14, the kind of face you got when life asked more of you than it should have at that age. She carried the stack of bowls to the wash basin, and he followed with the pot, and they stood there side by side and washed up in silence for a few minutes. "You any good at biscuits?" he asked finally. "Decent. Better than bread." He nodded, considering this. "We've been out of biscuits for 3 months," he said. "I can't get the flour ratio right." "I can show you," she said. "Tomorrow morning, if you want." He looked at her with that measured expression again, like he was adding something up and not quite sure of the total. Maybe, he said. She didn't push it. She dried her hands and left him to finish, and she climbed the stairs to the room at the end of the hall. The sewing room was small and dusty and smelled like cedar, and something faintly floral that she couldn't name. There was a narrow bed against one wall. Somebody had made it up recently. The sheets were fresh. And a window that looked out over the back of the property where she could see in the last of the evening light the shape of the mountains going purple against the sky. There was also, on a small table by the window, a thimble. It was silver, tarnished. It had been left there, she thought, not forgotten. There was a quality to the way it sat, centered on the table, like it had been placed. She stood there looking at it for a long time. She thought about the woman who had used this room. Wade's letters hadn't said much about his wife, only that she had died 4 years ago and that the boys had been very young. She'd been careful not to ask too many questions in her letters back because it hadn't felt like her territory. But standing here now in the room that had belonged to this woman, with the thimble sitting in the center of the table like a small monument, she felt the weight of it, the particular weight of coming into a life already in progress, a house already shaped by someone else's hands, someone else's presence. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the iron key. She turned it over in her palm. It was old and heavy, the kind of key made to last, with a simple loop at the top. She looked at the door she'd just come through and the lock beneath the handle, an old lock, the kind that matched. She set the key on the table next to the thimble. They sat there together, the old and the new, the before and the after. She opened the window to let the evening air in. Outside she could hear voices, the boys, somewhere behind the house, in the middle of some argument or game she couldn't quite make out. And underneath that, lower, the sound of a man's footsteps crossing the porch, then stopping. She looked down. Wade was standing in the yard below her window with his hands in his pockets, looking out at nothing, just standing there in the last of the light. She watched him for a moment. He didn't know she could see him. His shoulders had a heaviness to them, a kind of held-in quality, like a man who had been bracing for something so long that bracing had become his natural posture. She thought about what she'd said in the kitchen, a partnership, or the beginning of one. He'd agreed, just the one short nod. But he'd agreed. She didn't know yet what that meant, or what it would cost either of them, or whether the 6 boys who'd sat around that table tonight would ever see her as anything other than an intruder in the house their mother had left behind. She didn't know if the warped pan could be fixed, or if she'd need a new one, or how long the ham hock would last, or whether Caleb was going to make trouble, or what Eli's face looked like when he smiled, if he still remembered how. She'd figure it out, one thing at a time. That was the only way she knew how to do anything. Outside, the mountains had gone from purple to black, and the first stars were appearing in the strip of sky above the ridge. Wade Mercer was still standing in the yard below, alone in the growing dark, carrying whatever it was he carried. And Evelyn Hart, Evelyn Mercer, now, she supposed she'd better start thinking of herself that way, closed the window halfway, sat down on the edge of the narrow bed, and let herself be tired for exactly 10 minutes. Then she got up, took out her notebook, and started making a list. The list she'd made that first night covered 2 pages by the time she set the pencil down. It wasn't organized in any particular order. She'd written things as they came to her, which was how her mind worked when she was tired and trying to think clearly at the same time. Wood box empty. Flour sack needs mending. Ash pan on stove. Window latch and kitchen sticks. Check frame for warp. Boys' boots. At least 3 pairs need resoling. Check henhouse door, warped pan, and then, underneath all of that, the things that weren't about the house at all. Caleb. Eli. What is he carrying? Thomas in the drawing, Wade's hands. She stared at that last line for a moment, then turned the page over. She woke before anyone else. She'd always been that way, even as a girl. Her body refused to sleep past the first suggestion of light, which had driven her mother to madness in the summers and served her well every other time. She dressed quietly in the gray pre-dawn and carried her boots downstairs rather than putting them on in the hall so as not to wake anyone, and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment just looking at it. It looked worse in the morning than it had the night before, not because anything had changed, but because daylight was honest in a way lamplight wasn't. She lit the stove first. The wood box was empty, which she already knew, so she went out to the woodpile behind the house and brought in enough for the morning. The air outside was cold in the way of early frontier mornings, sharp and still and carrying the smell of sage and something damp from the direction of the creek. The sky was going from black to deep blue above the eastern ridge, and somewhere out past the barn a rooster was making up its mind. She brought the wood in, stoked the stove, and put water on for coffee. Then she emptied the ash pan because she couldn't cook comfortably over a stove whose pan was full, and she couldn't start a day in a kitchen that needed something obvious done and not do it. She found a proper coffee tin on the second shelf. There was some left, not a lot, and measured it out carefully. The coffee was on and the stove was warming, and she was assessing the flour situation when she heard footsteps on the stairs. She turned. Eli stood in the kitchen doorway, dressed, his hair still flat on one side from sleep. He stopped when he saw her and then looked at the stove and then back at her. "You're up," he said. "So are you." He came in slowly, the way of a person moving through a space that had been theirs and might not be anymore. She stepped sideways to give him room and turned back to the flour sack. "I'm thinking biscuits," she said, "if you still want to see how I do it." A pause. "The lard's low." "I know. There's enough for this morning." She looked at him over her shoulder. "You want to learn or not?" He pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table. "I'll watch," he said, which was not a yes, but was also, she'd learned in exactly 12 hours of knowing Eli Mercer, about as close to one as he got. She talked through it as she worked, not in the way of a teacher performing a lesson, but the way her own mother had taught her, which was by talking to herself out loud and letting whoever was listening pick up what they could. She explained why the lard needed to be cold, how to feel when the flour was right, why you folded instead of stirred. She explained what happened when you overworked the dough and why the biscuits would tell you so by coming out hard and flat. Eli said nothing for most of it. He watched her hands. When she put the pan in the oven, she turned around and found him with his elbows on the table and his chin propped on one hand, still watching, and for a moment he looked exactly his age. 14, not the version of himself he put on for other people. Then he noticed her looking and sat up straight. "My mother made biscuits," he said. It came out flat, almost accidental, like he'd meant to think it and said it instead. She didn't make a thing of it. "Most women out here do. Biscuits travel well in their filling." He nodded once. "She did them different, thinner. There's a dozen ways." She wiped her hands on her apron. She'd found it on a hook behind the pantry door, and it fit badly, too long at the hem and too wide at the waist, and she'd folded the ties twice to keep it from dragging. "Was she a good cook?" He was quiet for a moment. "Better than me." "Well," she said, "that's not a very high bar from what I can tell." He looked at her sharply, and then, just barely, just for a second, something moved in his face that might have been a smile. It was gone immediately, but she'd seen it. "They won't be as good as hers," he said, nodding toward the oven. "Probably not," she agreed, "but they'll be biscuits. And biscuits are better than nothing, which is what everyone's had for 3 months. He didn't argue with that. The rest of the household came down in stages, the way of any house with 6 people in it. Sam appeared first, 9 years old and already dressed in a state of cheerful disorder. Shirt untucked, one boot on the wrong foot, which she noticed but said nothing about. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he smelled the coffee and the biscuits and said, "Oh," with a sincerity that almost undid her. Marcus came next, 12 and quiet in a way that was different from Eli's quiet. Eli was watchful. Marcus was somewhere else, always, his mind running on a track she hadn't yet located. He sat down at the table and pulled a small book from his shirt pocket and opened it and began reading without acknowledging anyone, which she found less rude than honest. Noah appeared, 15, with the particular expression of a boy who had decided last night that she was probably fine and was now trying to decide if that decision was still operative in the morning light. He looked at the biscuits on the counter where she'd set them to cool for a moment before the table and then looked at her. "Those smell good," he said, grudging, but real. "They're almost ready," she told him. Thomas came down last, or almost last. He was holding Caleb's hand, which surprised her, and Caleb was allowing it in the way of an older brother who had stopped pretending it bothered him. Caleb himself looked like he'd been up for a while. There was hay on his sleeve and his boots were already muddy. He'd been out to the barn. He sat at the far end of the table again. Thomas sat next to him and looked at Evelyn with the measuring look she was beginning to recognize as his default state. "Sit down, all of you," she said, "before they get cold." She put the biscuits on the table with the butter and the last of a jar of preserves she'd found at the back of the pantry, blackberry, which had been put up the previous fall and was still good. She poured coffee for herself and for the place at the head of the table where Wade would presumably sit if he appeared, and then she sat down. Nobody moved for a moment. She got the feeling that meals at this table had not recently involved the expectation of waiting. "Go ahead," she said. They went ahead. For 5 minutes there was nothing but the sound of eating, which she had long believed was one of the more honest sounds a household could make. Biscuits pulled apart. The soft noise of butter. Thomas, discovering the blackberry preserves, made a sound of pure involuntary pleasure and then looked embarrassed about it, which made Sam laugh, which made Thomas laugh too, and for about 30 seconds the kitchen had something in it that it probably hadn't had in a while. Then Caleb said, "Where's Pa?" "I don't know," she said. "I assumed he'd be down. He doesn't usually eat breakfast." Caleb was looking at his biscuit rather than at her. "He eats when he stops for water, mostly, around 9 or 10. She absorbed this. "Does he know supper's at 6? Caleb shrugged. "We eat when things are done." "Supper's at 6, she said, "starting tonight." He looked up at her then, not hostile exactly, something more complicated. "He works till dark this time of year. Then he can come in dirty. Supper's at 6. Eli, at the edge of her vision, was looking down at his plate, but the line of his shoulders had changed. Caleb held her gaze for a moment and then looked away. Not conceding, exactly, just deciding not to fight about it right now. She took it. But she found Wade in this far pasture at mid-morning, mending the section of fence she'd noticed from the wagon. She'd gone out to look at the hen house. The door was indeed broken. A hinge had given out, and the wood had swelled from a recent rain, and the whole thing needed rehanging. And on her way back, she'd seen him out by the fence line and gone over. He was working alone, which didn't surprise her. He had the look of a man who had been working alone for so long he'd stopped noticing it. "Good morning," she said from the other side of the fence. He looked up. He had a fence post in both hands, braced against his thigh. "Morning." He looked at her with something that might have been mild surprise. She had the impression he hadn't expected her to seek him out. "Everything all right in the house?" "The henhouse door needs rehanging. The bottom hinge is gone entirely and the wood swelled. I can't do it myself." She paused. "I could if I had the tools and knew where they were." "Sam knows where the tools are," he said. "He can show you. The wood you'd need is in the barn back left." She filed that away. "The boys ate this morning. All of them." "They always eat." "Biscuits," she said. "Real ones." Something moved in his expression. "That's good. Eli's been trying for a while. He watched how I did it. He'll be able to do it himself by the end of the week." She looked at the fence he was mending, at the tools laid out in the grass beside him, at the line of posts that needed doing. It was a long section. He was alone. "Supper's at 6, she said, "starting tonight." He set the post down and looked at her properly. "Caleb tell you I don't usually—" "Yes, it doesn't matter. 6 o'clock. He studied her. She wondered what he was looking for, what he'd expected her to be. The letters they'd written each other had been careful, civil, informative in the way of two people trying to make a decision without really knowing each other. She told him about her experience keeping house, her family, the fact that she had no serious illness and her teeth were her own, which was apparently the sort of thing that was relevant in these arrangements, and which she'd found both practical and faintly absurd. He'd told her about the ranch, the boys, the work. Neither of them had said much about what they actually were. "I'll try," he said finally. "That's all I'm asking." She left him to his fence and walked back toward the house, and she did not look back to see if he was watching her go. By afternoon, she had reorganized the kitchen. She did it methodically, the way she did everything. Took everything off the shelves first, assessed what was there, discarded what was past saving, and put it all back in an order that made sense for how a kitchen actually worked. Things used daily at hand height, things used weekly above, things used for special occasions in the back of the top shelf where they'd be out of the way but findable. She found in the process 3 things of note. The first was a good cast iron skillet, a large one, the best piece of cookware in the kitchen. shoved to the very back of the bottom cabinet behind a pot with a cracked handle. It had some rust on it, which meant it hadn't been used in a while, but it was salvageable. She set it to the side. The second was a tin box, tucked in behind the flower on the middle shelf, which turned out to contain handwritten recipe cards in a woman's careful script. She didn't open more than the top card before she closed the tin and placed it on the shelf near the window, separate from everything else. That was not hers to reorganize. The third thing she found was Thomas, sitting under the kitchen table. She only discovered him when she crouched down to check the bottom cabinet again and found herself face to face with him. He was sitting with his legs crossed and his back against the wall, and he had, she now noticed, been there for some time. "Thomas," she said, somewhat startled. "Hi," he said. "Have you been under there this whole time?" He considered this. Some of it. She sat down on the floor in front of the cabinet, which was not a dignified position but seemed like the appropriate response. "Are you comfortable down there?" He nodded. "It's good for watching." "Watching what?" He looked at her like this was a strange question. "Things." She looked at him for a moment. He had dark eyes like his father, and a serious way of holding his face that was also like his father, but underneath it she could see something more open, more unguarded. He hadn't learned yet how to close himself off completely, the way the older boys had. He was 4. He was still partly transparent. "Did you eat all your biscuit this morning?" she asked. "And Marcus's," he said without apparent guilt. He wasn't hungry. Was he? He said he wasn't. Thomas paused. "Marcus always says he's not hungry, and then he eats everybody's leftovers." She filed that away. "Come out from under there and help me," she said. "I need someone to tell me where things are." He emerged, slowly, with the dignity of a very small person who has decided to cooperate but wants it noted that it's their choice. He stood beside her and looked at the kitchen she'd rearranged, and she watched his eyes move over it, cataloging. "The coffee tin moved," he said. "Yes, I put it lower so you can reach it." He looked at her. "I'm not supposed to make coffee." "No," she agreed. "But you can get it down for someone who is." He thought about this with great seriousness, then nodded. "Okay." They spent an hour like that, her working, Thomas narrating in his flat, solemn way the history of where things had been and why. Some of it was useful. Some of it was the kind of information only a 4-year-old would find relevant. Which shelf Sam had once knocked a jar off of, the fact that Caleb had once dropped an egg and cried about it, and didn't want anyone to know, what color the curtains had been before they'd been taken down for washing and never rehung. She listened to all of it. Boo. The skillet took most of the afternoon to restore. She worked on it with a piece of rough cloth and some salt, and a patience she hadn't needed to call on in a while, scrubbing out the rust in circles, wiping it down, building the seasoning back up in the oven with a thin layer of lard. It was the kind of task that looked like nothing from the outside but required you to be entirely present, and she needed that today. The particular blankness that came from doing a physical thing well. Noah found her at it around mid-afternoon. He wandered into the kitchen with the vague air of someone who didn't have a specific destination and stopped when he saw her crouched by the oven. "What are you doing to that pan?" "Fixing it." He leaned in the doorway. He was 15, tall for it, with an openness to his face that his older brother lacked. He hadn't yet built the wall all the way up. "It's been in the back of that cabinet for 2 years, he said. "I know. It's a good skillet. It deserves better." He watched her work for a moment. "Caleb uses the smaller one." "I know. This one's bigger, better for feeding 8 people." 7, he corrected. "Pa doesn't—" "8, she said firmly, and didn't look up. Noah was quiet for a moment. She could feel him deciding something. "He really works until dark," he said. "It's not that he doesn't want to eat, it's the season. There's a lot." She put the skillet in the oven and straightened up. He was watching her with something that she recognized after a moment as the particular anxious hopefulness of a boy who wanted an adult to not be angry and didn't quite know how to say so. "I know," she said. "I'm not angry at him." "You sounded like you were." "I sounded definite," she said. "That's different." She looked at him. "Your father has been running this place alone for 4 years, from what I can tell. He's gotten used to nobody expecting anything specific from him at specific times. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying it's going to change. Noah absorbed this. He had a way of processing things slowly, deliberately, that she was starting to appreciate. You're going to push him, he said. I'm going to have supper on the table at 6 o'clock, she said. He can decide what to do with that. Noah looked out the window at the pasture, where they could just see the distant shape of his father still at the fence line. He pushes himself pretty hard already, he said. Sometimes I think he's trying to work himself to death, and just hasn't finished yet. The words landed flat and matter-of-fact, the way of someone saying something they'd thought so many times it had lost its weight. But the weight was there. She could feel it under the plainness of it. She didn't say anything for a moment. She dried her hands and moved to the window to stand beside him. Out by the fence, his father's figure was small in the distance, working alone against the long afternoon light. How long has it been like this? She asked. Not the way of a woman gathering information, the way of a person who actually wanted to know. Noah shrugged. Like what? Like this. Quiet. Everyone running their own piece of it separately. He didn't answer right away. She let the silence sit because with some people silence was an invitation, and with others it was a wall, and she was still learning which kind Noah was. Since Ma died, he said finally, maybe a little before. She was sick for a while before. He paused. Pa kind of held us together for a year or so after, did everything, and then he just stopped, I think. Not on purpose. He just got to where the only thing he knew how to do was work. He looked at his hands, so we figured out the rest. She thought about Eli in the kitchen at 14, trying to figure out flour ratios. Thomas under the kitchen table watching things, the boots everywhere, the unmended fence. The way the boys had sat at supper last night with the careful distance of people who'd learned not to need each other too much, in case need was something else that went away. You've done a good job, she said. He looked at her sideways like he expected the butt. I mean it, she said. You've kept each other alive and fed and the ranch running. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. He looked away again, his jaw moved. She recognized that too. The particular effort of a boy trying not to feel something in front of someone he didn't fully trust yet. We've just been getting by, he said. For now, she said, getting by is enough. We'll build from there. Wade came in at 6:15. She'd had supper on the table at 6, as promised. The boys were seated, the food was out, and at exactly 6 o'clock she'd told everyone to go ahead because she wasn't going to make 6 children sit in front of a hot meal and wait for a man who might not show up. Marcus had said, "What about Pa?" And she'd said he knows when supper is, and that was the end of it. At 6:15 the door opened and Wade came in. He looked at the table, at the 6 boys eating, at the empty place at the head, at the pot she'd kept warm on the back of the stove. He looked at her. She put a plate in front of his place and sat down. He hung his hat and sat down. Nobody said anything. The meal continued. After a moment, he picked up his fork. She'd made a proper roast from a cut of beef she'd found in the cold room. She'd spent 20 minutes in the cold room that morning, taking real stock, with the potatoes and turnips and a sauce from the pan drippings. It was the most substantial meal she'd cooked so far, and she'd timed it carefully, keeping it from drying out while she waited. He ate 2 full plates. When supper was done and the boys were clearing up, she'd established this last night, rotating, each boy responsible for specific tasks which had been met with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Wade remained at the table. She poured the last of the coffee and set a cup in front of him and sat down across from him with her own. The kitchen around them was loud with boys and argument and the clatter of dishes. In the middle of it, they were briefly, oddly, alone. The fence section on the north pasture, she said. How much more of it needs doing? He looked at her over his coffee cup. 3, maybe 4 more days. Noah could help you. Noah's got the cattle. Sam could move the cattle for a day. He's 9. He can manage a small herd on flat ground. Wade was quiet for a moment. Sam is capable, she said. He's more capable than anyone's giving him credit for. He showed me where all the tools were this afternoon. He knows this property better than you might think. He looked at her. She'd seen that look before. The particular look of a man encountering information about his children that surprised him, and wasn't sure whether to be relieved or embarrassed that he hadn't known it himself. Noah could help with the fence, she said again more gently. It'd go faster. You'd be done in 2 days instead of 4. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. She'd noticed he did that, a rotating motion with both palms, something to do with his hands when he was thinking. He doesn't usually like fence work. He doesn't like doing it alone while you're doing it alone at the other end of the pasture, she said. That's different from not liking it. Wade looked at her for a long moment. She held the look because she'd said what she meant, and she wasn't going to walk it back. You've been here 2 days, he said. Not accusatory, just noting it. I know, she said. You already know more about my boys than… He stopped. The sentence died somewhere before it finished, but she heard the shape of it anyway. They talk to me, she said carefully, or they let me talk to them, which is close enough for now. She paused. They're good boys, Wade. All of them. They've just been left to manage things they shouldn't have had to manage, and they've done it without complaining, and that means nobody's noticed how hard it's been. He was looking at his coffee cup again. His jaw was set, and she recognized the set of it. She'd seen it on Caleb's face, the same shape of stubbornness, the same unwillingness to let something show. I know it's been hard, he said finally. I'm not… He stopped again, started over. I know I've let things slide. I'm not criticizing you, she said. Sounds like you are. I'm telling you what I see. She kept her voice even. Because you asked for a partner, and that's what a partner does. You can be irritated by it if you need to. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, one of the boys, she thought it was Sam, said something that made Marcus laugh. And then Thomas repeated the laughing sound with no idea what was funny, and the kitchen briefly sounded like what it was, a house full of people. Wade set his coffee cup down. Noah can help with the fence tomorrow, he said. If he wants. He'll want to, she said. He pushed back from the table and stood. He looked down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not warm, not cold, something in between, something working itself out. Thank you, he said. For supper. 6 o'clock, she said. Every night. The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the closest thing she'd seen from him, and she held on to it after he went upstairs, held it in her mind the way you hold on to small evidence when you're trying to build a case. Eli appeared at her elbow. More coffee? He asked, holding the pot. She looked at him. This boy with his careful face and his 2 old eyes, and the tin of his mother's recipe cards on the shelf where she'd put it that morning, visible from where they both stood. Yes, she said. Thank you, Eli. He poured it without spilling. He was getting steadier in the kitchen, she thought, getting used to having someone else in it. Not easy yet, not comfortable, but no longer braced for something to go wrong. That was enough for now. Outside the kitchen window, the mountains had gone dark again, and the stars were thick across the valley, and Blackstone Ranch was quiet in the particular way of a place where 7 people were getting ready to sleep under one roof, all of them still strangers in some sense, all of them beginning, whether they knew it or not, the slow and difficult work of becoming something else. 2 weeks in, she found the pattern. Every household had one. A hidden architecture of habit and avoidance that you couldn't see from the outside, but that revealed itself once you lived inside it long enough. Blackstone Ranch's pattern was this. The boys operated in separate orbits, each one managing his own small piece of survival, and the orbits never crossed unless they absolutely had to. Caleb handled the barn and the horses and anything that required strength or authority. Eli handled the kitchen, and by extension the younger boy's immediate welfare in the way of someone who'd been handed a responsibility he hadn't asked for and couldn't put down. Noah moved cattle and mended and ran whatever errands needed running into town. Marcus read and disappeared and reappeared when meals happened. Sam ran between all of them doing whatever was needed, which meant he was both the most useful person on the ranch and the most invisible, and Thomas followed whoever would let him. None of them asked each other for help. She watched it happen over and over, a boy struggling with something for 20 minutes rather than asking the brother 3 feet away. She watched Eli carry in 3 loads of wood by himself when Noah was standing idle at the fence. She watched Sam spend an entire afternoon trying to fix a bridle that Caleb could have repaired in 10 minutes. She didn't intervene every time. She wasn't sure it was her place yet, but she filed it away, all of it, in the same mental notebook she'd been keeping since the first night. Wade's pattern was simpler and harder. He woke early, worked until dark or past it, ate when she put food in front of him, and said as little as possible about anything that wasn't related to the ranch. He wasn't cold exactly. He said good morning and thank you, and he'd taken to pausing in the kitchen doorway before heading out, which she'd come to understand was a kind of check-in even when nothing was said. But he kept the space between them carefully managed. Civil, correct. He was treating her like a business arrangement that was going well, which was what she was, technically speaking, and which she found both reasonable and quietly maddening. The iron key stayed on the table in the sewing room. She'd started using the room in the evenings. She'd brought her mending up there, and a small lamp, and it had become the one place in the house that was purely hers. She'd moved the thimble to the windowsill, not to claim territory, but because the morning light hit it differently there, and she liked the way it looked. She still hadn't been in his room. They hadn't discussed it. That was its own conversation. Waiting. The first real break in the household surface came on a Thursday, and it came from the direction she least expected. Marcus had been sick for 2 days. Not dramatically sick, just the kind of low-grade feverish sick that made a person miserable without being serious enough to command attention. He'd eaten less at supper the first night, which she'd noticed but said nothing about, then nothing at all the second morning, which alarmed her more. When she went upstairs with a cup of broth and knocked on the room he shared with Noah and Sam, she found him in bed with his book open on his chest and his eyes closed, which meant he'd stopped reading, which meant he felt worse than he was letting on. "I brought you something," she said. He opened his eyes. He looked at her with the wariness he'd been maintaining since she arrived. Not hostile like Caleb's, not cautious like Eli's, just remote. Marcus existed at a slight remove from everything, including apparently his own fever. "I'm fine," he said. "You have a temperature." "It's just a cold. Drink this." She set the cup on the crate he used as a bedside table and stood back so he didn't feel crowded. He looked at the broth with the expression of someone who wanted it and wasn't going to admit it, then picked it up and drank some. She sat down on the edge of Noah's bed, which was the nearest surface, and looked around the room. 3 beds, 3 crates, 1 window. The floor was clean. Somebody swept in here. She was fairly sure it was Marcus, because it was the tidiest room in the house, and tidiness seemed like a thing that would matter to him. There were books stacked everywhere, not haphazardly the way books accumulated in most boys' rooms. These were organized by size, roughly, and there were more of them than she'd expected. She counted quickly, at least 40. "Where did you get all these?" she asked. He followed her eyes. "Some were Ma's. Some I traded for." He paused. "Pa brings me one sometimes when he goes to town." She looked at him. He was watching her notice this, watching to see what she'd do with it. She filed it carefully. "Wade brings Marcus books from town." It was the most specific act of fatherly attention she'd heard about in 2 weeks, and she stored it. "What are you reading?" she asked. He tilted the cover toward her. She read the title and said, "That's a hard one." "It's not that hard." "I've read it. It's hard." She met his eyes. "What part are you on?" He told her. She nodded because she remembered that part, and then without quite planning to, she said what she'd thought when she read it at roughly his age, which was that the character was making the wrong choice and knew it and made it anyway. And there was something both infuriating and completely true about that. Marcus looked at her with his flat expression for a moment, and then said that he thought the character was making the only choice available, and the book's whole point was about how sometimes there isn't a right choice, only less wrong ones. She sat with that for a moment. "You might be right," she said. He looked faintly surprised. She suspected he wasn't often told he might be right. They talked about the book for 20 minutes, which was the longest either of them had talked to the other since she'd arrived. He finished the broth without appearing to notice he'd done it. When she stood to go, he looked at the empty cup with a kind of mild self-consciousness. "Thank you," he said, "for the broth. I'll bring more at supper," she said. "You don't have to come down if you don't feel up to it." He nodded. She was almost to the door when he said, "She used to do that." She stopped. "Bring things up when we were sick," he said. He was looking at the book, not at her. "We haven't been sick very much since. I think we've been trying not to be." She stood in the doorway for a moment, not sure what to do with that. There wasn't anything to do with it, really. You couldn't fix it with broth or biscuits or a reorganized kitchen shelf. You could only hear it. "Try to sleep a little," she said. She went back downstairs and stood in the kitchen for a long moment by herself, her hands on the counter, looking at nothing. The fight with Caleb happened on a Friday evening. It had been building since she'd arrived. She'd known it, he'd known it. Probably everyone in the house had known it. The tension between them was the specific tension of two people who both believed they were in charge of the same thing and had different definitions of what that thing was. She'd been patient about it because she understood it. He was 17, and he'd been the man of this household in every practical sense for longer than his age suggested, and she'd walked in and started reorganizing his kitchen and setting times for meals and having conversations with his father, and he had every right to his resentment, she thought. It didn't make the resentment easier to live with, but she understood it. The proximate cause was Thomas. She'd been teaching Thomas to help set the table. Simple things, spoons and napkins, things he could carry without dropping. He liked having a job. She'd noticed that about him early. He was 4, but he was not a child who wanted to be handled. He wanted to be useful. So she'd given him useful things to do, and he'd started appearing in the kitchen in the late afternoons with an air of readiness that she found equal parts exhausting and endearing. That evening he'd carried a stack of bowls from the counter to the table, moving very carefully, his tongue between his teeth. He'd made it successfully and was reaching up to arrange them when his elbow caught the edge of the stack and the top 2 bowls went over the side of the table and hit the floor. One broke, the other didn't. Thomas froze. His face went through 3 expressions in about a second. Surprise, calculation, and then a kind of braced stillness that was not the response of a 4-year-old who expected comfort. It was the response of a child who had learned that things breaking led to silence and distance, and nobody quite knowing what to do. She crouched down immediately. "Hey," she said. "Look at me." He looked at her. His lower lip was going. "It's a bowl," she said. "Bowls break. Are you hurt?" He shook his head. "Then let's clean it up." She started picking up the pieces, and after a moment he crouched down beside her and started helping, and she let him, because helping was what he needed. "This piece goes here, and this... Careful, the edge is sharp. Let me get that one." They were still on the floor cleaning it up when Caleb came through the kitchen door. He took in the scene, the broken pieces, Thomas's face, and landed immediately on a version of events that didn't include accidental. "What did you do?" he said to Thomas. Sharp. The voice of a boy who'd said that sentence too many times. Thomas flinched. Something ignited in Evelyn's chest. She kept her voice level. "He bumped the table and a bowl fell," she said. "It was an accident. He's always breaking things." Caleb went to the counter and reached past her for something. The motion dismissive, "I'm done with this." "You shouldn't have him carrying bowls." "He's 4, she said. 4-year-olds carry bowls." "Not my mother's bowls." The kitchen went very quiet. Thomas had stopped moving. Even the fire in the stove seemed to settle. She stood up slowly. Caleb was facing the counter. His shoulders were rigid. "Caleb." She kept her voice even. "Look at me." He turned. He had the expression of someone who knew they'd said something they couldn't take back and had decided to stand behind it anyway. "Those are dishes," she said. "They're for using. That's what your mother would have wanted them for." "You don't know what my mother would have wanted." "No," she said. "I don't." "You're right." She held his gaze. "But I know that a bowl is a thing you eat from, and the people in this house eat. And your brother was trying to help set the table, and he's 4 years old, and you don't get to speak to him like that for dropping something." His jaw tightened. "I wasn't." "You were." Still even. She wasn't going to raise her voice. That was the thing she'd learned about Caleb in 2 weeks. Raising your voice only gave him something to push against. "You know you were." He looked away. His hands were flat on the counter, pressed hard enough that the knuckles were going pale. "I'm not her," Evelyn said. "Quiet now." "I know that. I'm not trying to be her. I'm not going to take her place in this house, or in your memory, or anywhere else. That's not what I'm here for." She paused. "But I am here, and your brothers are here, and we all have to live in the same house. And that means we have to treat each other with some basic decency, including your littlest brother, who was trying to do something good." Caleb said nothing. His throat moved. Thomas had retreated to the far side of the table and was watching them both with enormous eyes. She glanced at him and said, "Can you go see if Noah needs anything in the barn?" And he went immediately, with the speed of a child relieved to be released. She and Caleb were alone. "You don't know what it was like," he said finally. His voice had changed. The hardness was still there, but something underneath it had shifted, the way ice shifts right before it breaks. After she died, you don't know what we had to... He stopped. Tell me, she said. He looked at her like it was a trick. I mean it, she said. Tell me. He was quiet for so long that she thought he wasn't going to. He was staring at the counter, at his own hands on it, and she watched him deciding whether to stay inside himself or let one thing out. Pa couldn't get out of bed for a month, he said. After. Thomas was barely walking. Eli was 12. I was 13. He said it the way you said facts. Flat, no drama, because if you put drama on it, the whole thing became something you couldn't hold. I did what needed doing. Somebody had to. I know, she said. And now you come in here and you... He made a gesture, vague and frustrated, that encompassed the organized kitchen and the dinner schedule and all of it. And it's supposed to be better, just like that? Not just like that, she said. No. Then what? She thought about what to say. She thought about what she actually believed versus what sounded right, because Caleb at 17 could tell the difference and would not forgive her for the latter. I think you saved this family, she said. I think you were 13 years old, and you did what had to be done, and that was an extraordinary thing, and nobody has ever thanked you for it properly, including your father. She let that sit. And I think it cost you something you haven't fully counted yet, and I think you've been running on the weight of all that for 4 years, and nobody has told you that you're allowed to put some of it down. He was very still. You don't have to be in charge of everything anymore, she said. I'm not saying step back and watch. I'm saying you don't have to carry all of it by yourself. His face was doing something complicated that he was working very hard to keep under control. She recognized it. She'd seen it on Noah's face, on Eli's, in different registers. The Mercer boys had all learned the same thing, which was that needing something was dangerous because what you needed could disappear. She's not coming back, he said. It came out flat, like he was saying it for the 1,000th time, and the saying was the only way he knew how to live with it. No, she said. She's not. So what's the point of any of... He stopped himself. The point, she said carefully, is that Thomas is 4 years old and he's going to grow up. And what he grows up remembering about this house is up to all of us, including you. She held his gaze. You're 17. You've been a man in this house since you were 13. That's real, and I'm not dismissing it. But you're also still a boy in some ways you haven't let yourself be, and that's a loss too. It's okay to let that be a loss. The silence stretched. Outside, she could hear Noah and Thomas in the yard, some exchange about the horses. Thomas's higher voice rising in what was probably a question. Normal sounds, life going on. Caleb looked at the broken bowl pieces she'd stacked on the counter. I'll clean that up, he said. All right. He picked up the pieces and took them out, and she turned back to the stove, and neither of them said anything else. And it was not a resolution, but it was something. A small door cracked open in a wall that had been sealed for years. She told Wade about it that night. She hadn't planned to. She'd planned to keep it between herself and Caleb, let the boy have his privacy in it, not make it into a report to his father. But Wade came in at 6 again. He'd been doing that consistently for almost a week now, sometimes closer to 6:15, but always before dark. Always. And after supper, when the boys had cleared out, he stayed at the table with his coffee, which had also become something of a pattern, and she found herself telling him, not all of it, just the shape of it. Caleb and Thomas and the bowl, and what Caleb had said about the month after his wife died. Wade listened without speaking. She watched him take it in, watched the way his face worked around it. He told you about that, he said when she finished. Some of it. He turned his coffee cup, slow rotation, both palms. I didn't know he remembered it that clearly. He was 13. 13 is old enough. I know. He set the cup down. I know it is. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't mean to leave them like that. I just couldn't seem to... He stopped, ran a hand over the back of his neck. I couldn't seem to get up. You were grieving, she said. I was their father. Both things can be true. He looked at her. There was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled blankness he usually offered, but something raw underneath it. something he hadn't meant to let show. "You make it sound simple," he said, not accusing, almost wondering. "It's not simple," she said. "None of it is. But beating yourself over it doesn't fix what Caleb's carrying. Talking to him might." He was silent for a long moment. "He doesn't talk to me." "He talked to me tonight," she said. "He doesn't know me. He's been here with you for 17 years. Wade absorbed that. She watched him absorb it, watched it move through him slow and uncomfortable, like something swallowed wrong. "What would I even—" he started. "Tell him what you told me," she said, "that you weren't trying to leave them, that you see what he did." She paused. "Tell him you're sorry it fell on him." Wade looked at her. "You're asking me to—" "Yes." "That's not—" He stopped. He was doing the thing again, the jaw-setting thing, the wall going up. She watched it happen and decided, for the first time, not to let it pass. "Wade," she said. He looked at her. "Your boys are drowning in work they shouldn't have to carry," she said. "Caleb's been the man of this house since he was 13. Eli feeds 6 people 3 times a day. Noah handles cattle on his own. Sam does whatever anyone needs without being asked. Marcus has put himself somewhere books live because it's the safest place he could find. And Thomas is 4 years old and he doesn't ask for things because he's already learned asking doesn't work." She held his gaze. "That is not a house. That's a survival camp, and your sons deserve more than survival." The words dropped into the kitchen and sat there. She hadn't planned to say it like that. All at once, direct, without the gentleness she'd been careful to maintain for 2 weeks. It came out because it was true, and she was tired of managing around it. Wade's face had gone still. Not blank. This was different from his controlled blankness. This was a man who'd been told something he already knew and had been not knowing it on purpose. "I know," he said. His voice was low. "I know you know," she said. "That's why I'm saying it out loud." He looked down at his hands. "I've been—" He shook his head. "I don't know how to—" He stopped again. He was a man who had built himself around action. She understood that about him now. Work was language. Work was love. Work was how he showed his sons he cared about them, by keeping the ranch running, by keeping them fed and housed and the land under their feet. And it had simply not been enough, and he knew it. And he had no idea what else to do. "You don't have to know how," she said. "You just have to start somewhere." He looked up at her. "Start where?" "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Go talk to Caleb." A long silence. The fire in the stove ticked. Outside, the wind was picking up, the kind of wind that came off the mountains in the late evening and moved through the valley grass in long waves. "And if he doesn't want to hear it," Wade said. "He might not," she said honestly. "But he'll know you tried." Wade looked at her for a long moment. She held the look because she meant what she'd said and she wasn't going to soften it now. "You don't give ground much," he said finally. "Not on things that matter." Something shifted in his face again. That almost thing that wasn't quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. "No," he said. "I don't suppose you do." He pushed back from the table and stood. He stood there for a moment looking down at her with an expression she still couldn't fully read, that composite of things he was working out. "Evelyn," he said. It was the first time he'd used her name. Not Mrs. Mercer, not Miss Hart, the way he'd slipped back into calling her twice in the first week. Her name, said plainly, without preamble. "Yes," she said. "I don't—" He paused. "I'm not good at this. The talking part." He said it not as an excuse, but as a fact he was giving her straight, the way you'd hand someone a tool and say it's a little worn, but it still works. "I want you to know I'm trying." She looked at him. This man who drove himself past dark every day, who brought his quiet boy books from town without ever mentioning it, who had stood alone in the yard the first night she arrived like a man who didn't know what direction to face. "I know you are," she said. He went upstairs. She sat at the kitchen table alone with the last of the coffee gone cold, listening to the wind move through the valley, listening to the house settle into its night sounds around her. And she thought about all the things that had been said in this kitchen tonight, and all the things that hadn't been. And she thought about what came next and whether she was up for it. She was tired in a way that was different from the tiredness of work. This was the tiredness of caring, the particular weight of having made yourself matter to people who didn't yet know how to let anyone matter to them. It was the most exhausting thing she knew, and also the only thing she'd ever found worth being exhausted by. She got up and washed the last 2 cups and hung the dishcloth and turned the lamp down. On the shelf by the window, the tin of recipe cards sat where she'd left it the first morning. She'd touched it maybe 3 times since then, never opening it beyond the first card. She stood looking at it for a moment. Then she left it where it was and went upstairs. She stood in the hall for a moment in the dark. Through the door of the room Caleb shared with Eli, she could hear the low sound of voices, both of them, still awake, talking. She couldn't make out words. She wasn't trying to. She just stood there and listened to the sound of it, 2 brothers in the dark talking to each other. And then she walked to the end of the hall and opened the door with the iron key and went inside. The window was ajar the way she'd left it. The thimble caught the moonlight on the sill. She sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel, for exactly a moment, how far she was from everything she'd known. How thoroughly she had bet herself on this family, this valley, this stranger and his sons. How thoroughly uncertain it still was. And then she lay down and closed her eyes. Because tomorrow the stove needed lighting before 5. And Eli wanted to try the biscuits himself this time, and Marcus was still a little feverish and needed watching. And Wade was going to have to find a way to talk to his oldest son, and none of it was going to be easy, and none of it was going to be smooth. And that was the plain truth of what she'd walked into. She'd known that from the wagon. She'd stayed anyway. That had to count for something. She heard them the next morning before she saw them. She was at the stove at 5:15, the kitchen still dark except for the lamp she'd set on the counter, the coffee just starting to come up, when she heard the barn door open and then 2 sets of footsteps crossing the yard. Not 1, 2. She stood very still and listened to them. The heavier tread she recognized as Wade's, and alongside it the particular gait of someone younger, longer-legged, who was trying to match a slower pace and not quite managing it. Wade and Caleb, together, before first light. She turned back to the stove and said nothing about it when they came in 40 minutes later, both of them smelling of hay and horses and morning cold, and she put coffee in front of them without comment and went back to the biscuits she was making. They sat at the table, not quite looking at each other in the way of people who have said something that can't be unsaid and are still figuring out what the air feels like now. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't supposed to be comfortable yet, but they were both there, at the same table, in the same silence, and that was different from before. Eli appeared and looked at his father and his brother sitting together at that hour, and then looked at Evelyn with a question in his face she didn't answer. She just handed him the butter and told him to set the table. The biscuits were Eli's, almost entirely. She'd talked him through the ratio twice the week before, and he'd been practicing. She'd come down 2 mornings to find the flour out and the bowl already used and washed and put back, which meant he'd been doing it before she woke up, trying to get it right without an audience. This morning she'd let him run it from the start while she managed the stove. They came out even, both sides. He looked at them when he pulled the pan out, looked at them with a kind of desperate neutrality, like he didn't want to care how they'd turned out. "Those are good," she told him. He looked at her. "I mean it. They're better than mine were the second week." He put them on the table without saying anything, but she caught the way his shoulders dropped, the infinitesimal release of someone who'd been braced. Caleb reached for one without being told and ate it in 3 bites and didn't say a word about it, which from Caleb was roughly equivalent to a standing ovation. Eli sat down and ate his own and stared at the table and did not smile. But there was something in his face that was quieter than usual, softer at the edges, small things. She'd learned to count the small things. The change in the house didn't happen the way changes in stories happened. It wasn't a moment, not a single before and after. It was more like the way ice melted on a slow-warming day, where you kept checking and it still looked frozen, and then at some point you looked again and it was just water. She'd been on Blackstone Ranch for 3 weeks when she first noticed it, and she couldn't have said exactly when it had started. Sam was the first, because Sam had the least invested in his defenses. He was 9, and 9 was young enough that the performance of not needing had worn thin faster than it had for the older boys. He started appearing in the kitchen not to be useful, but simply to be nearby, which was a different thing entirely. He'd sit at the table and do nothing, just exist in the same room while she worked, and after a few days of this she started talking to him. Not about anything important, just the running commentary of someone thinking out loud. The way her grandmother had cooked, the name of the creek back home, whether she thought the spotted hen or the brown hen was likely to be more trouble. He answered when he had opinions, which was often. He had a lot of opinions for 9. One afternoon she was mending a shirt that had given out at the elbow, one of Noah's, which had been in the pile at the bottom of the mending basket so long she'd assumed it was a lost cause. And Sam was at the table with a piece of rope he was attempting to make into something. And he said without looking up, "How come you don't have kids?" She kept her eyes on her work. "I was never married before." "How come?" "There wasn't the right person." He considered this with the directness of a 9-year-old who had not yet learned that some questions were intrusive. "What about Pa? Is he the right person?" She kept her needle moving. "I think he might be," she said. "We're still finding out." "Oh." He went back to his rope. After a moment, "Caleb says you're going to leave eventually." The needle stopped. She made it start again. "When did he say that?" "Last week, to Noah." He pulled at the rope. "He said women like you come out here and decide it's too hard and go back." She finished the stitch she was on and tied it off and cut the thread. She turned the shirt to check her work. "What did Noah say?" "He said to shut up." She folded the shirt. "Caleb's been disappointed before," she said. "He's protecting himself." Sam looked up at her then with his direct, uncomplicated eyes. "Are you going to leave?" She looked back at him. "No," she said. "I'm not." He nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to his rope. She went back to the mending pile, and neither of them mentioned it again. But she thought about what Caleb had said. Women like you come out here and decide it's too hard and go back. And she felt the truth in it, that he'd been building that assumption since before she arrived, that every act of competence she displayed was probably being weighed against the day she'd use it to leave more efficiently. He was 17 and he'd watched his mother die and his father go somewhere unreachable for a month. And he'd decided, somewhere in the calculus of survival, that the safest position was to expect nothing from people who had the option of leaving. She couldn't argue him out of that belief. She could only stay. Walk. Wade talked to her differently now. It was subtle. The controlled civil distance he'd maintained in the first 2 weeks had shifted by small degrees into something more like actual conversation. He'd started asking her things. Not about the ranch, not logistics and planning, but things she hadn't expected. One evening he asked her about Cincinnati, about what it was like to grow up in a city, and she'd told him about the river in summer and the way the market smelled on Saturdays, and the particular sound of a city waking up at 5 in the morning. And he'd listened with the focused attention of a man encountering a world he'd never seen. And it occurred to her that he'd spent most of his life in this valley, and that the valley was his entire geography, in a way that was both beautiful and limiting. Another night he told her how he'd gotten the ranch. He told it plainly, without drama, the way he told most things. He'd come out here at 22 with 2 other men and they'd built the first structure by hand, and then his partners had moved on and he'd stayed, and he'd built more, and then he'd met his wife in town and married her and brought her here, and they'd built the rest together. "She was better at it than me," he said. "She had a sense for what a place needed. I knew how to work." She knew what the work was for. Evelyn sat with that for a long time after he went upstairs. She was starting to understand what she'd married. Not just the ranch or the boys or the 6 years of accumulated grief that lived in the walls of this house, but the particular shape of this man, the things he could do and the things he'd never learned, the ways he showed love that were invisible unless you knew to look for them, and the ways he'd simply never been taught to show it at all. He was not a simple man. He'd looked like one from the letters, practical, direct, a widower who needed help, but he was not. He was a man who brought his quiet son books and didn't mention it. A man who had built a ranch from nothing by sheer insistence and then found himself unable to build the thing his family actually needed. A man who'd stood alone in the yard the first night she arrived like he was waiting for permission to go inside. She thought about what she felt for him. It wasn't what she'd expected to feel after a month. She'd told herself that feeling would come slowly, if it came at all, that she'd made a practical arrangement, and love, if it arrived, would arrive in its own time and couldn't be forced. What she actually felt was more complicated and less neatly categorized. She found him exhausting in his silences and surprising in the moments when the silences broke. She found herself wanting to know what he thought about things. She found herself some mornings listening for his footstep on the stairs before she'd quite admitted she was doing it. That was something. She didn't know what to do with it yet, but it was something. Besides, the first time he reached for her hand was so unexpected she almost pulled away. They were in the barn. A mare had been showing signs of colic for 2 days, and Wade had been checking on her regularly, and Evelyn had started going with him not because she was useful in a medical capacity. She wasn't. She had no particular experience with horses. But because those 20 minutes in the barn in the evening had become a kind of neutral territory, where conversation happened more easily than it did in the house. Away from the boys, away from the table, away from the accumulated domestic weight of everything that needed doing, they were just two people standing in a barn watching a horse. The mare was better that evening, standing more comfortably, eating a little. Wade checked her with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done it many times, running his hand along her flank, checking her breathing, her belly. The horse turned her head and nosed at his jacket with a familiarity that suggested a long relationship. "She's going to be all right," Evelyn said. "I think so. She's tough." He straightened up and they stood side by side for a moment in the lantern light, and then he said without preamble, "Caleb's going to college, if I can arrange it." She looked at him. "He knows this? I told him this morning, in the barn." He paused. First time I'd said it out loud. He was looking at the mare, not at her. "There's a school in Denver that does agricultural studies. He's smart enough, he just doesn't know it. I've been putting money back for 2 years. Another pause. "I should have told him sooner. Does he want to go?" He said he didn't know. Wade's mouth moved. But he asked how long the program was, and what it cost, and whether he could come back after. A beat. "So I think that means yes." She looked at this man's profile in the lamplight, at the set of his jaw that was different tonight from the way it usually was. Not braced, not held, just there, tired and real. "That's a good thing," she said. "It'll mean more work here without him," he said. "I want you to know that going in. We'll manage." He looked at her then. She held his gaze and something passed between them that was not quite named yet but was present and warm and very specific. Then he reached over and took her hand. Just that. His hand over hers, the way you'd steady something without knowing you were going to until you'd done it. His palm was rough from the work and warm, and he held her hand the way of someone not entirely sure of the protocol, but certain enough to proceed. She didn't pull away. She turned her hand over in his, and they stood there for a moment in the barn with the mare breathing softly behind them, and the lantern making a small circle of light in the dark. "I'm glad you came," he said. Simple, plain, no performance. She didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that wasn't already in the fact of her hand in his. They walked back to the house together. He held the lantern and she held the door, and they didn't need to navigate any of the space between them because, for the first time since she'd arrived, it didn't feel like space that needed navigating. Marcus got better by the end of the 3rd week and came fully back into the life of the household with the slightly dazed quality of someone who had missed things and was catching up. He noticed the kitchen reorganization without commenting, sat through 2 suppers watching the table's altered dynamic, Wade present and at the head, conversation happening across multiple channels instead of running in isolated pockets. And then on a Thursday evening, he brought his book to the kitchen instead of going upstairs after dinner. He sat at the end of the table and read. She washed up. After a while, he said without looking up from the page, "I finished it." "The ending frustrated you," she guessed. "The ending was wrong," he said. "The author would disagree." "The author was wrong." He turned a page. "The character should have made the other choice." "The character couldn't," she said. "Why?" She dried her hands and sat down across from him. "Because making the right choice requires believing you deserve the right outcome," she said. And that character never believed that. It was built into him from the start. Marcus looked up from the book. He was looking at her the way he looked at things he was taking seriously. "That's a sad reason." "Yes," she agreed. "It is." He looked back down at his book. "Do you have others?" he asked. "Books, I mean." "In my trunk." "A few. Can I borrow one?" "When you finish that one," she said. "Come ask me." He nodded, turned another page, and said nothing else. But he stayed at the table for another hour, and when he finally went upstairs, he said good night. Not to the room in general, but to her specifically, looking at her when he said it, which was a thing he had not done before. The difficulty with Noah came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. She'd thought of Noah as the most straightforwardly open of the older boys. He'd been the first to compliment her cooking, the first to respond to simple overtures with something resembling reciprocal warmth, the first to have an actual conversation with her in the yard that wasn't transactional. She'd assumed, without quite examining the assumption, that he was handling the changes in the household better than his brothers. She was wrong. She found him in the tack room one afternoon, supposedly repairing a harness. He'd been in there for 2 hours, which was at least an hour longer than the harness required, and when she looked in, she saw him sitting on an overturned crate with the harness in his lap and his hands still. Noah. He looked up. His eyes were red, which he immediately tried to cover by turning his head and doing something with the harness. She came in and sat on the bench across from him and said nothing, because sometimes that was what was needed. He held out for about 45 seconds. Then he said, "I don't know why I'm—" and stopped. "You don't have to know why," she said. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth. His shoulders were shaking slightly with the effort of holding something in. "It's stupid," he said. "What is?" He was quiet for a moment. "Last night at supper," he said finally. Pa laughed. She waited. He told that story about the fence post and the old mule, and he laughed at the end of it. Noah's voice was rough. "I haven't heard him laugh since before Ma died." He stopped. Started again. "I couldn't even remember what it sounded like. And then last night I heard it, and He shook his head. "I couldn't eat. I had to leave. I don't even know what's wrong with me." She didn't say anything right away. She sat with it because it deserved to be sat with. "Nothing's wrong with you," she said. "You've been waiting a long time for that. It shouldn't make me—" He pressed his lips together. "Noah." She waited until he looked at her. "You've been holding this family together from the inside for 4 years. The quiet way, the way nobody noticed, keeping your brothers from fighting, keeping your father from seeing how bad things were getting, doing whatever needed doing without anyone having to ask. I see that." She held his gaze. When something finally shifts, when you actually see something you've been holding your breath for, sometimes the body doesn't know what to do with the release. It just comes out. He was quiet for a long moment. "Ma used to say I worried too much," he said. He said it the way Marcus said things about his book. Flat, like a fact. But underneath the flatness there was the whole weight of someone who had loved a person and lost them, and was still finding pieces of that loss in unexpected places. "She wasn't wrong," Evelyn said. "But the worrying has kept a lot of people safe." He looked at her. He had, she thought, his father's eyes. The same dark color, the same depth. But where Wade's were controlled and careful, Noah's were still open. He hadn't closed that off yet. She hoped he never would. "You're going to stay," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," she said. "I'm going to stay." He nodded. He looked down at the harness. After a moment he started working on it again, his hands steadier now, and she stayed in the tack room with him a while longer because leaving too quickly would make the moment feel clinical, like a problem she'd solved and moved on from, and it wasn't that. She stayed until the harness was done. The conversation she hadn't been able to plan for happened on a Sunday. She'd been at Blackstone Ranch for 5 weeks, and Sunday was the one morning the rhythm of the house was different. The ranch work paused slightly, not entirely, because cattle didn't observe rest days and neither did horses, but the quality of the morning was different, less driven. The boys tended to surface at different times, the meals ran looser, and for a few hours the house felt less like a working operation and more like a place where people lived. She was in the sewing room. She'd finally begun to use it for what she intended. She'd set up her small writing desk under the window, and she'd been working on a letter to her sister in Cincinnati, which she'd been composing in her head for weeks, and had never quite gotten around to actually writing. She was trying to explain what this place was and finding it harder than she'd expected. She'd written 3 drafts that all started the same way and all stopped at the same place, which was the part where she tried to say what she felt. She heard a knock and said, "Come in," expecting Thomas or Sam. It was Caleb. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. He always had his hat. She'd come to understand it was both a habit and a kind of armor, and looked around the room with the expression of someone who hadn't been in here in a long time. "Sorry to bother you," he said. "You're not." She put her pen down. Come in. He came in slowly, the way he did everything when he wasn't trying to make a point with it. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at the table with the thimble on the windowsill and the iron key next to her writing things and the small changes she'd made. The lamp, the desk, the mending basket in the corner. I wanted to say something, he said. He was looking at the thimble. About what I said. About Thomas and the bowl. She waited. I shouldn't have talked to him like that, he said. He's 4. He didn't do anything wrong. He paused. And you were right, about what Ma would have wanted. She said nothing. She was learning when to let Caleb say a thing without interrupting it. She wasn't precious about stuff, he said. She used to let me use her good bowls to feed the barn cats when I was little. She said things were for using. He turned the hat in his hands. I forgot that. For a while I was trying to keep everything exactly the way she left it, and I think I made it worse. You were trying to hold on to her, Evelyn said. He looked at her. His face was the most open she'd seen it. Yeah, he said. I was. She looked at this boy, and for the first time she saw him clearly as a boy, 17 and carrying the weight of someone twice his age, standing in his dead mother's sewing room with his hat in his hands, trying to say something that cost him. The recipe cards, she said carefully. The tin on the kitchen shelf. I found them the first morning. I haven't opened them. He looked at her. I thought you might want to keep them, she said, or share them when you're ready, or not. But it seemed like a decision that should belong to the family, not to me. His jaw worked. You could use them, he said finally. If you want, Eli would... He stopped. Eli misses her cooking. We all do. He paused again. That doesn't mean we don't like yours. It was possibly the most generous thing he'd said to her since she'd arrived, and she recognized it as such without making him feel that she did. Thank you, she said simply. He nodded. He looked around the room once more at the space she'd made of it, careful and quiet and unmistakably hers while still holding what had been there before. Pa seems better, he said, not looking at her. The last couple weeks? He turned his hat one more time. I don't know if that's you or just... I don't know. It's all of us, she said. It's everyone in this house doing something differently. He considered that. Including me? Including you. He put his hat back on. I'm going to Denver, he said. In the fall. Pa told you? He mentioned it. I haven't decided for sure. He said it like a man who had decided and needed a minute more to admit it. But probably. It's a good school, she said. You'll do well there. He looked at her. How do you know? Because you kept this place running at 13, she said, and that took more than most men have. He didn't respond to that. He just stood there for a moment, and then he said, Supper's going to be late if nobody starts it, and she said she'd be down in 10 minutes, and he left. She sat at her desk for a moment after he went. The letter to her sister was still unfinished in front of her, stopped at the part where she tried to describe what she felt. She picked up the pen. She wrote, I think I understand now what I came here for. It wasn't to fix anything. It was to be present long enough that fixing became possible. There is a difference, and it took me 5 weeks to see it clearly. She capped the pen and went downstairs. Eli was already in the kitchen. He'd gotten out the flour, the lard, the tin of recipe cards, which she'd brought down from the shelf and left on the counter that morning without saying anything about it. He was standing over it with it open in his hands, reading his mother's handwriting in the serious way he read everything, and he didn't look up when she came in. She went to the stove and started on the fire and let him read. After a moment he said, She did her pie crust with a little vinegar. I always wondered why it was so flaky. Cold fat and a little acid, Evelyn said. It keeps the gluten from tightening. He turned the card over. There's notes on the back. What do they say? He read for a moment. Mostly reminders to herself. Don't rush the crust. Let the boys help even if it takes longer. He paused. Don't forget the boys like the burnt edges of the pan. His voice had gone quiet toward the end. He closed the tin carefully and set it back on the counter. I think I want to try her apple pie, he said, when the apples come in, if that's all right. That's more than all right, Evelyn said. He nodded and picked up the flour, and they began making supper together, and the kitchen filled up gradually the way it did every evening now. Sam first, then Thomas attached to someone's hand or sleeve, Then Marcus, with a book he'd set down reluctantly. Then Noah, smelling of horses, and eventually the sound of Wade's boots on the porch. And the table that had been so quiet when she arrived was loud and imperfect and occasionally irritating and completely alive. She stood at the stove with the restored cast iron skillet in her hand, and the smell of Eli's mother's recipe coming out of the oven, and the sound of her husband asking one of his sons something she couldn't quite hear, and she thought, this is what the work was for. Not the biscuits or the cleaned ash pan or the reorganized shelves or the mended fence or any single thing she'd done in 5 weeks. All of it together, day by day, the accumulated weight of showing up. That was what had moved the needle. Not one conversation, not one crisis, not one breakthrough, just staying. Thomas appeared at her elbow with his solemn face and his hands clasped together. I want to stir something, he said. She handed him the spoon. The apple pie happened on a Saturday in late September. Eli had been watching the apple tree at the south end of the property for 2 weeks, checking it the way he checked everything, quietly, without announcing his intentions, with the particular patience of someone who had learned that wanting things too openly was a form of risk. When he finally decided the apples were ready, he went out at 7 in the morning and picked them himself and brought them in and set them on the kitchen counter without saying what they were for, as if the fact of their presence was enough. Evelyn saw them when she came in from feeding the chickens. She looked at them and then at him and didn't say anything because she understood by now that Eli required space the way some plants required shade, not because he was fragile, but because he did his best growing without too much direct attention. She made herself scarce that morning. She took her mending to the porch and sat in the September sun and let him have the kitchen. He was in there for 3 hours. She could hear him through the window. The sound of the rolling pin, the particular rhythm of someone working dough, occasional silences that probably meant he was consulting the recipe card. Once she heard something fall and a word she pretended not to hear, and then the sounds resumed. Thomas found her on the porch at some point and climbed up beside her and sat with his shoulder pressed against her arm in the way he'd developed over the past weeks, which was less about needing something and more about simply choosing to be next to her, which was its own kind of statement from a 4-year-old who had spent his early life learning not to choose things. Eli's making Ma's pie, Thomas said. I know. He told me not to go in. He's concentrating. Thomas considered this. Is it going to taste the same? She looked at him. He was asking with the seriousness he brought to all important questions, his dark eyes steady, and she understood that the question had layers to it that a 4-year-old probably couldn't fully articulate, but was asking anyway in the only words available. I don't know, she said honestly. Probably not exactly the same. Nothing ever tastes exactly the same as the way you remember it. She paused. But it might taste good in its own way. He thought about this for a moment and then nodded, apparently deciding this was an acceptable answer, and went back to watching the yard. The pie came out at noon. Eli carried it to the table himself and set it down and stood back and looked at it. The crust was imperfect. One edge had browned more than the others, and there was a crack across the top where he'd pressed the lattice together wrong. But the kitchen smelled like apples and cinnamon, and something warm and specific that she couldn't name, but that made Noah stop in the doorway and go very still for a second before he came in. Nobody said anything about the smell. They all just moved to the table. Wade came in from outside, looked at the pie, looked at Eli. You made that, he said. From her recipe, Eli said. Careful, like he was offering something he wasn't sure would be accepted. Wade looked at his son for a long moment. Something moved in his face that he didn't try to manage or control. He put his hand on the back of Eli's neck, just briefly, just a second, and then he sat down. They ate the pie after lunch. It was slightly too sweet and the crust was thicker than it should have been, and it was the best thing that had been on that table in years, and everyone at the table knew it, and nobody said any of that out loud. Thomas ate his piece and then looked at his plate and said, I don't remember what hers tasted like. The table went quiet. He was 4. He'd been barely walking when his mother died, and he had no memory of her that was actually memory. Just the shapes other people's grief had left behind, the outline of someone he'd never really known. Tell me, he said. To the table in general, to no one specific. And then something happened that Evelyn would think about for years afterward. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't, but because of what it was. Caleb told him first. He told him about the burnt edges his mother always left in the pan because she knew he liked them. Then Noah said she'd had a way of humming while she cooked, never a real song, just sounds. Sam said he remembered she used to let him lick the spoon. Marcus, who had barely spoken during meals in the first weeks, said quietly that she used to read to them on Sunday evenings, and that she did different voices for different characters, and that she was better at the villain voices than the hero ones. Eli said she made the pie every fall, and it meant summer was over, and he'd always hated that part. But he'd loved the pie. Wade listened to all of it with his hands flat on the table. When they finished, he said simply, "She would have liked all of you, exactly the way you are now." He didn't say it to impress anyone. He said it the way he said most things, plain, without decoration, because he meant it, and that was reason enough to say it. Evelyn was quiet through all of it. It wasn't her story to enter. She sat at the table and bore witness to it, which was what the moment called for. And she thought that this right here, these 6 boys and this man talking about someone they'd all loved and missed in separate silence for 4 years, this was what she'd been working toward without knowing it. Not the organized kitchen, or the 6 o'clock suppers, or the mended fence. This, the permission to remember together. The letter from Denver came in October. It was addressed to Caleb, and he carried it unopened from the mailbox at the end of the property road all the way back to the house. And he set it on the kitchen table and stood there looking at it with his hat in his hands. Evelyn was the only one in the kitchen. She looked at the letter and then at him. "Open it," she said. "In a minute." She went back to what she was doing. She heard him pick it up. She heard the paper. He was quiet for long enough that she turned around. He was staring at the letter with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Not the guarded, controlled expression of a boy who had learned to expect loss, but something younger and less armored. "They took me," he said. She put down what she was holding. "Caleb, they took me," he said again, louder, like saying it twice made it real. She crossed the kitchen and read over his shoulder. The letter was formal, official, the language of an institution stating plainly that one Caleb James Mercer had been accepted for the autumn term of the agricultural program at the Denver School of Land and Sciences, contingent on receipt of his enrollment fee by the 1st of November. "You need to show your father," she said. He was already moving toward the door. She heard him crossing the yard, heard him call for Wade, heard the particular quality of his voice, open, unguarded, young, in a way she hadn't heard it before. And she stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the two of them meet in the middle of the yard, watched Wade take the letter and read it, watched him look up at his oldest son. She couldn't hear what Wade said, but she saw him pull Caleb in and hold him for a moment, and she saw Caleb's hands come up and grip the back of his father's jacket, and she turned back into the kitchen and let them have it. Sam appeared at her elbow from somewhere. "What happened?" "Caleb got into college," she said. Sam's face opened up like a window. "Really?" "Really." He ran outside to tell the others, and within 5 minutes the yard was full of boys and noise, and Caleb at the center of it with an expression she'd never seen on him, undone in the best way, like something he'd been holding together with both hands had finally been allowed to relax. That night at supper, Wade told them what it would mean. Caleb leaving in January. More work for everyone. Adjustments. He laid it out plainly because that was how he approached things. But as he talked, she noticed something she hadn't seen at the beginning. He asked questions. He asked Noah what he thought about taking on the eastern fence line. He asked Eli if he was comfortable managing the household provisioning with a list she'd put together. He asked Sam, who sat up straighter when addressed directly, whether he thought he could handle the morning feeding if Noah was on the far pasture. He asked. He didn't assign. That was different, and she caught Noah and Eli exchanging a glance across the table that acknowledged it without saying so. "What about me?" Marcus said. Wade looked at his fourth son. "What about you?" "I mean, what's my job?" Wade considered. "What do you want it to be?" Marcus blinked, apparently unprepared for the question. Then he said carefully, "The accounts. I've been watching what you do with the ledgers. I think I could do it." Wade looked at him for a long moment. "You're 12, he said. "I know. I'll check your work." "I'd expect you to." Something like quiet pride moved through Wade's face. He nodded. "All right. You do the accounts." Thomas, who had been following the conversation with great seriousness, said, "What about me?" "You," Caleb said from his end of the table, "are in charge of the chickens." Thomas considered this with immense gravity. Okay, he said. The table laughed, really laughed, all of them, including Wade and including Caleb, whose laugh she'd never heard before, which turned out to be loud and surprised and a little undignified, which made her like him considerably more. She sat in the middle of it and let it be loud and imperfect and real. She and Wade had their hardest conversation on a Thursday night in November, when the first hard frost had come down off the mountains and the house was cold in the way it would be until spring. She'd known it was coming. There were things between them that had never been said plainly, things that had been circled and approached and left, the way you leave a fire from too close because you're not sure if you're ready for the heat. They'd been living in the same house for 3 months, and in many practical senses they'd built something real and functional and even warm. And in another sense, they were still two strangers who had signed a document and were trying to figure out what it meant. He came upstairs late. She heard him on the stairs and heard him stop in the hallway, and then he knocked on the door of the sewing room. She said, "Come in." He stood in the doorway. He looked at the room the way Caleb had looked at it, taking in what she'd made of it, what she'd kept, the thimble on the sill, the iron key on the writing desk next to her pen and paper, and the half-finished letter to her sister she'd been working on for the past hour. "Can I sit down?" he said. "Yes." He sat on the edge of the narrow bed and put his elbows on his knees and looked at his hands. She turned her chair to face him and waited. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to tell me the truth, even if it's not what I want to hear." "All right." He was quiet for a moment, not building up to it. Just finding it. "Are you happy here?" She held the question for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the question deserved more than the first available answer, which was the kind that could be given quickly, but didn't always mean what it should. "Happy is a complicated word," she said finally. "I'm not unhappy. There are days that are very hard. There are days I wake up, and for about 30 seconds, I can't quite remember why I'm in this room, in this valley, on this side of the country." She paused. "And then I hear Thomas on the stairs, and I smell whatever Eli's started in the kitchen, and I remember." She looked at him. "That's not unhappy. That's something else." He was watching her carefully. "What is it?" "I think it's a life," she said. "I think it's what a life feels like when you're actually in one rather than waiting for one to start." He was quiet. His hands turned against each other, the slow motion she'd come to know well. "I'm not easy to live with," he said. "I know. I don't talk enough. I go somewhere in my head, and I don't come back fast." "I know that too. And He stopped. "I don't know how to—" He ran a hand over the back of his neck. "I'm trying to learn how to do this differently than I did before, than I did with—" He stopped again. He did that, stopped himself before her name. She'd noticed it. She'd never asked about it. "You can say her name," Evelyn said gently. "It's all right." He looked at her. "Clara," he said. "Just the name. Quiet." "Tell me about her," Evelyn said. "If you want." He looked at his hands. "She was brave," he said. "Braver than me, in most ways that counted. She came out here knowing it was going to be hard, and she never complained about it. She just—" He paused. "She found what was good in things, even the bad things. She had a way of—" He shook his head. "I couldn't do that after she was gone. I couldn't find the good in anything. I just worked." "That was how you survived," Evelyn said. "It wasn't enough." "No," she said. "But you did what you could with what you had, and your boys are here, and the ranch is here, and you've all made it this far." She paused. "That's not nothing, Wade." He looked at her. "You say that a lot. That's not nothing." "Because it's true, and people don't say it enough." He almost smiled. She was used to the almost now. The corner of his mouth that moved before he thought better of it, the way humor lived in him just under the surface and rarely quite made it out. She'd come to find it more telling than a full smile would have been. "I want to do better," he said. "By you. I want to—" He paused, searching for the word. "I want this to be real, not just an arrangement." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who worked himself past dark and brought his quiet son books and stood alone in yards, and had finally, after 3 months, said her name the way you said someone's name when they mattered. It already is, she said. You just haven't been looking at it straight. He held her gaze. I'm looking at it now, he said. I know. The frost was settling outside the window. She could hear it in the silence, the particular quality of cold air on cold glass. The thimble on the sill caught the lamp's light and held it. He reached over and picked up the iron key from her writing desk. He turned it in his hands the way he turned the coffee cup, both palms, that thinking motion. Then he looked up at her. You know this doesn't have to be your room, he said. She held that sentence still for a moment. I know, she said. He set the key down between them, not giving it back, not taking it away, just setting it there. There's no rush, he said. I just wanted you to know. I know that too, she said. Thank you for saying it plainly. He stood. He stood in the middle of the small room, and for a moment he looked like what he was. A man who had been alone for a long time and was just beginning to understand what it might be like not to be, and who was a little afraid of that and not ashamed of being afraid. She could see all of it in his face because he'd stopped managing his face, at least in this room, at least tonight. Good night, Evelyn, he said. Good night, Wade. He left. She sat for a moment in the quiet, and then she picked up her pen and finished the letter to her sister. What I want you to understand, she wrote, is that I didn't come here to rescue anyone. I came because I was 26 years old and I'd spent enough of my life waiting for circumstances to be right, and I decided that the circumstances were never going to be right, that there was no version of this where it was easy going in, and I'd rather be in the middle of something difficult and real than waiting on the edge of something comfortable and empty. I don't know if that was wisdom or stubbornness. Probably both. They tend to arrive together. She set the pen down and looked out the window at the dark. Caleb left for Denver on a Thursday in January, on the same mail coach that had brought Evelyn to the valley 8 months before. The whole family walked with him to the end of the property road. It was early and cold, and nobody was entirely awake yet, which meant nobody was performing. They just walked, all 8 of them, through the frost-hard grass in the gray morning light. At the road, Caleb set his bag down and turned around to face them. He shook Noah's hand and then pulled him in briefly, awkwardly, the way of boys who hadn't quite learned how to hug yet and were trying anyway. He told Marcus to keep the account straight, and Marcus said he would. He told Sam to look after the horses, and Sam said obviously, with the confidence of someone who had been told he was capable and had started to believe it. He crouched down to Thomas. Thomas looked at him with the gravity he reserved for important things. You're coming back, he said. It was not a question. Yeah, Caleb said. I'm coming back. In summer? End of summer. Thomas nodded. This was acceptable. He put his arms around Caleb's neck and Caleb held him for a moment and then put him down gently and stood up. He looked at Evelyn last. She'd expected him to say something brief and managed, something that maintained the distance he'd kept for most of the past months, the careful civil distance that was as close to warmth as he'd allowed himself. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment with the particular look of someone who has figured something out and is not entirely comfortable with how long it took them. You fixed the lopsided biscuits, he said. She blinked. What? The second week you were here, Caleb says they're lopsided, and you said I should make them myself. He paused. I was being an idiot. You were scared, she said. Both, he said. Can be both. She looked at this boy, this almost man who had held an entire family together with his hands and his pride and his refusal to let anything else fall, and she felt something for him that she hadn't quite named until now. Not maternal, exactly. Older than that. The thing you felt for someone who had done hard things in hard circumstances, and had come out still mostly intact and still capable of standing at a road in January and admitting he'd been wrong. Right when you get there, she said, tell Eli what the food's like. He'll want to know. He almost smiled. The full version this time. The one she'd been waiting 8 months to see. Crooked and brief and entirely real. I will, he said. He picked up his bag. He shook his father's hand and Wade held it an extra beat, something passing between them that didn't need words. Then Caleb turned and walked down the road toward the mail coach stop in town and didn't look back, because he was 17 and going somewhere, and looking back would have broken the spell of it, and she understood that too. They watched him go until the road curved and took him from view. Thomas slipped his hand into hers. She looked down at him. He was watching the empty road with a 4-year-old's complete acceptance of what is. Caleb had gone down the road, and Caleb had said he was coming back, and that was the whole of it. She held his hand, and they walked back toward the house. Spring came early that year, the way it sometimes did in the valley. Tentative at first, a few warm days strung together like a test, and then all at once the grass came up green and the creek ran high, and the cottonwoods put out their pale leaves, and the whole world looked like it had been washed. She found the hen house fully repaired one morning in March. Not by her. She'd fixed the bottom hinge back in her first week, but the whole structure had been needing a proper overhaul for months. New wood and reset frames and a working latch that actually caught. She came out to feed the chickens and stopped and looked at it. She found Noah in the barn. "Did you fix the hen house?" He looked up. "Sam and I, yesterday afternoon." "You didn't say." "It needed doing," he said. Then, after a pause, "Figured you'd see it." She stood in the barn doorway for a moment. 8 months ago, Sam had known where the tools were and nobody had thought to ask him. And Eli had been carrying the kitchen alone. And Noah had moved cattle in silence on the far pasture. And Marcus had retreated into books as the only available shelter. 8 months ago, the hen house had been broken and would have stayed broken for another season because there was no mechanism in this house for one person's need to become another person's action. Now there was. She didn't say any of that to Noah. She just said, "It's good work." And he nodded and went back to what he was doing, and she went back to the chickens. She was in the sewing room on a Sunday evening in April when Wade came upstairs with 2 cups of coffee and knocked on the open door. He'd started doing this some weeks ago, appearing in the evenings with coffee instead of waiting for her to come down, which was a small thing, but was also the kind of small thing that, accumulated over weeks, meant something larger. She'd started leaving the door open. They'd found a rhythm, the two of them, that neither had designed and both had arrived at by just continuing to show up. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed and handed her the coffee and looked out the window at the spring evening. The mountains were going orange in the last of the sun. "Got a letter from Caleb," he said. "I know." Eli read it out loud at breakfast. "He's doing well." "He's doing very well," she said. "He asked about the east fence in his last 3 letters. He's managing the ranch in his head from 300 miles away." Wade looked at the window. "He's like his mother," he said. She could never turn off the thinking either. He said it easily, which it hadn't always been. Claire's name, Claire's memory, the simple act of putting her into a sentence without it costing him something visible. The past months had done that. Not healed it. She didn't think grief healed in the way people like to say it did. It just got incorporated, worn smooth by the continuing of life, carried differently. He still went quiet sometimes in ways she recognized. Still had mornings where the weight of it settled on him before he'd gotten out of bed. But he didn't go away anymore. He came back. "Marcus did the quarterly accounts," she said. "Did you check them?" "This afternoon. He made one error and caught it himself before I found it." He turned the coffee cup. "He's going to be better at the books than I ever was. He needs more math than he's getting," she said. "There's a school in the county that does proper instruction. I think you should think about it. It's a day's ride. He could board in town during the week, come home Fridays." He looked at her. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since February," she said. "I was waiting to see how the accounts went first. I wanted to know if he'd stick with it or lose interest." She paused. "He's stuck with it." "He does that," Wade said. "When he finds a thing. You should tell him that." He looked at her. "I'm beginning to think your whole purpose here is to make me say things out loud." "Someone has to," she said. His mouth moved, the almost, and then past it, a real one, held a beat before it settled back into the everyday terrain of his face. She'd seen the full version maybe a dozen times in 8 months. She'd learned to appreciate the rarity. They were quiet for a moment, comfortable in the way that took time to build and couldn't be rushed, the quiet of 2 people who had sat in the same space often enough that silence had stopped being a gap and become a kind of conversation. "I've been thinking about the back bedroom," he said. She looked at him. "What about it?" "Thomas is going to need his own room," he said. "In a couple of years. He's still small enough that sharing doesn't bother him, but—" He paused. He was not looking at the window anymore. He was looking at her. "I thought maybe this room could be something else, and you could—" He stopped. Started again. "I want you to know you're not a guest," he said. In this house. You're not an arrangement. I want you to know that. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the wagon pulling up to this house in August, the hat box in the dust, the 6 boys watching her from various distances with the wary eyes of children who had been disappointed before and were prepared to be disappointed again. She thought about the iron key, cold in her palm, the note that said, "Nobody uses it now." She thought about the list she'd made the first night, 2 pages of things that needed doing, and the line at the bottom she'd turned over rather than let herself look at too long. "I know I'm not a guest," she said. "I've known that for a while." "But I haven't said it plainly," he said. "No, you haven't." He picked up the iron key from the writing desk. He looked at it. Then he set it down in front of her and left his hand over it for a moment. "Come live in the house," he said, plainly, like it was a simple thing, even though they both knew it wasn't. "Not in the arrangement room at the end of the hall. In the house. With us." She looked at his hand over the key. She looked at his face. She thought about what she'd written to her sister. "I decided that the circumstances were never going to be right, and I'd rather be in the middle of something difficult and real." She thought about everything the past 8 months had been. The difficult and real of it, the imperfect, the exhausting, the 6 boys and the broken things, and the hard conversations, and the pie and the recipe tin, and Caleb's letter from Denver and Thomas's hand in hers at the road, and this man, this particular man, who brought books for his son and held his wife's hand in a barn, and had stood alone in a yard for 4 years not knowing how to come inside. "All right," she said. He let out a breath. She hadn't known he'd been holding one. She picked up the key and turned it in her hand and then set it on the windowsill next to the thimble, where the morning light would hit them both. They were quiet for a moment. Outside, the spring evening was going blue, and the creek was audible from here, running high from the snowmelt. And from somewhere in the house she could hear voices. Marcus explaining something at length to Sam, Sam disagreeing, the sound of Thomas's feet on the stairs, Eli's low voice asking if anyone had seen the good spoon, a house in full voice, imperfect and alive and entirely itself. "The coffee's getting cold," she said. "It was already cold when I brought it up," he admitted. Wade. "I didn't plan that far ahead." She looked at him and shook her head, and whatever expression was on her face made him produce the real smile again. The full one, held longer this time, with something in it that was tender and embarrassed and entirely human. She picked up her cold coffee. He picked up his. They sat in the small room at the end of the hall while the house around them was loud and breathing and alive. And they drank their coffee in the kind of silence that is not empty but full, the kind that only comes after long work and great patience, and the willingness to stay when staying is the hardest available choice. This was not a perfect story. It was not even a complete one. Caleb would come back from Denver different, and they'd all have to adjust to who he'd become. Marcus would board in town for school and hate it for 2 months, and then find one friend and come home Fridays with a look she recognized as the beginning of something. Noah would be offered land of his own when he was 22, and would struggle for a year trying to decide, and Wade would give him the room to struggle without pushing him either way, which was something he couldn't have done a year before. Sam would turn out to have a gift for horses that would become his whole life's work. And Thomas would remember nothing of the time before Evelyn and would not think of it as a loss because you couldn't miss the shape of something you'd never known you needed. And Wade would learn slowly, the way he learned everything, with great effort and uneven results, and the stubborn refusal to stop trying that was his most fundamental quality. He would learn to say the things out loud. Not all of them. Not always. But enough. Enough that she knew, and enough that his sons knew, and enough that it changed the temperature of the house on an ordinary evening in ways that were impossible to point to and undeniable anyway. There was a thing Evelyn had come to understand about belonging that she hadn't known when she stepped off the wagon in August with her trunk and her iron key and her 2-page list of things that needed doing. She'd believed, going in, that belonging was something you were given, that it arrived after enough time had passed or enough work had been done, that there was a threshold you crossed and then you were on the other side of it. She'd been wrong about that. Belonging wasn't given. It wasn't even earned exactly, though it required work. It was built, the way the ranch had been built, the way all things worth having were built, piece by piece, day by day, by people who had decided to keep building even when they were tired and didn't know what they were building toward. You decided you were part of something, and then you acted like it. And then, one morning, you were. The key on the windowsill caught the last of the evening light. The thimble next to it did the same. Two objects from different histories sitting in the same light, in a room in a house in a valley at the edge of the frontier, where a woman who had crossed half a country on a bet she'd made with herself sat drinking cold coffee with her husband and listening to her family be alive in the rooms below. The mountains beyond the glass were going dark. The creek ran and the grass moved and the cottonwoods stood in their new leaves along the water's edge, and Blackstone Ranch was loud and imperfect and entirely, finally, home.